In this video, I'll be talking about two more principles of visual communication as they relate to layout: symmetry and asymmetry, plus stable and dynamic. Let's start off with the one which you are likely most familiar. Symmetry is a fairly simple thing. If you have an axis going through a page, whether it's vertical, horizontal, or at an angle, and you have elements on one side of that axis and you reflect them across the other side of the axis, you've created symmetry. Now, asymmetry means that there is not a reflection of elements within a composition. Asymmetry is really nothing more than the absence of symmetry. Now, as you're looking at the positive elements, we have to remember that the negative space is important, right? Right! So let's go back to the symmetrical arrangement here and look at the negative space. Note how the negative space is just as symmetrical as the objects themselves? And then when you come to the asymmetrical arrangement, look at how different that negative space is, how much more interesting the shapes are. Notice how there seems to be more movement through the negative space because of the more dynamic shapes. This does not mean that asymmetry is better than symmetry. They are both equally important design approaches, but they serve very different purposes. Typically, symmetry is best for focusing the viewer on a single element. Symmetry frames the content and presents it in a very straightforward manner, whereas asymmetry moves the viewer's eye dynamically from one element to another in a particular order. You need to understand these differences so that you can apply them to their greatest effect. You need to decide what will communicate your message most effectively. But even though symmetry and asymmetry accomplish very different things in a layout, they do have one thing in common. They're both trying to achieve visual balance within a given space, a balance of the elements to each other and to the format itself. Okay, let's look at these ideas in action in actual layouts. This is a poster for a wine festival, and you can see that the arrangement is symmetrical. If you draw a line right down the middle of the format, you'll see that the left side of the layout is pretty much identical to the right side. In fact, it's absolutely identical.
Yes, dear.
And look at the photograph. Even the photograph is symmetrical. All of these elements are related to each other by virtue of that center line. Now here's an asymmetrical layout. Exactly the same elements, just arranged in a non-symmetrical way. You can see that the photograph is also asymmetrical. But I think you'll also see that the layout has a very good balance to it. Just as strong, I would argue, as the symmetrical layout. A common misconception that some people have is that asymmetry means freeform. It doesn't. Asymmetry can have just as much balance and structure as a symmetrical arrangement. So let's look at these two layouts together now. You decide for yourself which you think is the better layout, and then also decide for yourself why that is. You need to have a reason for why you hold that opinion.
Oh, man!
And here are two more versions of the layout. Again, all the same elements in this case. All I've done is transpose the photographs so that on the left you have a symmetrical layout with an asymmetrical photograph, and on the right is the opposite. So which of these two do you like the best? And then between all four, which do you think is the best solution to this communication problem? Well, this is a bit of a trick question. You may have a personal preference, but the reality is that you can't say which is the best solution, because the best solution is going to be defined by what audience you're trying to reach. This is a very important point, as visual communication can be very subjective. You must understand the audience, or demographic, to whom you're communicating. How people perceive what you're presenting them can be greatly dependent on their life experiences, education, gender, ethnicity, age, culture, etc. These are all things that can affect how they will perceive your communication. It's very simple. If you don't care enough to understand them, why should they listen to you? Okay, next up, stable and dynamic, which is all about how actively you move the viewer's eye around a given space. Is the arrangement of elements rigid and kind of static, or does the placement of the elements give a feeling of motion and energy? Is the viewer's eye easily moved around the format, or does it move through in a predictable, structured way? Stable and dynamic are both important layout approaches, but they bring very different energies to your visual communication. So in this example, the cover of a book about marbles, you can see that the layout is asymmetrical, but it's also very stable. There's certainly a lot of interesting things going on in this arrangement, but
Groovy.
there isn't a lot of movement. This has everything to do with the placement of the elements and how the negative space is working. The negative space is really just a bunch of white columns between the shapes. Also, that big black rectangle at the top of the format is giving it a very rigid kind of stability. Now in this example, all the same elements have been used, but the manner in which they've been placed and scaled within the format creates a much more dynamic arrangement of the elements. Your eye moves through this composition easily and quickly, even though the layout is more complex. Note that even the shape of the type is designed to keep your eye moving through the layout. So as we look at these two layouts together, I'm going to say the same thing to you that I did about symmetry and asymmetry.
Whatever.
One isn't better than the other. You may have your personal favorite, but you can't really determine which is the best solution without knowing who is likely to buy this book. To wrap this video up, it's very important that you understand that there is no right or wrong when solving visual communication problems. There's only the best solution for a given audience. Are they young or old, male or female, college or high school educated, lower, middle, or upper class? What is their predominant cultural influence? And perhaps most importantly, are they dog or cat people? Understanding all of this is key if you hope to engage and motivate the viewer in the most powerful way. The ideas we've discussed here will help you to that end.